Hey guys, tonight we begin with something slow, quiet, and a little unsettling, but in the most relaxing historical way possible. So if you're listening in bed, maybe dim the lights a bit, put your phone face down, and let your mind wander somewhere far away. Somewhere centuries back. Somewhere full of candlelight, creaky wooden ships, and kings who probably should have married outside their own family tree. But of course, they did not. Tonight's story drifts through a strange corner of history, the slow arrival of sickness into royal bloodlines. Not the dramatic kind with battles and swords and loud trumpets. No. The quiet kind. The kind that sneaks in through generations. The kind that shows up at court dinners, awkwardly sits in the corner, and refuses to leave for about 300 years. And oddly enough, some of the earliest whispers about strange illness and fragile royal bodies begin with ships. Yes. Ships. Because in the medieval and early modern world, ships were basically giant floating delivery systems for, well, everything. Silk, spices, diplomats, gossip, suspiciously expensive parrots, and occasionally, diseases that absolutely nobody ordered. So tonight, we float gently back to Europe, somewhere in the late medieval period. The sea is busy. Merchant ships move slowly between ports like Venice, Genoa, Lisbon, and Barcelona. They carry barrels of wine, sacks of grain, crates of oranges, and sailors who haven't slept properly in 3 weeks. And with them, they carry rumors. At first the rumors are small. A strange illness in one port city. A noble family where several children seem unusually weak. A young prince who struggles to walk properly. Nothing dramatic. Just little whispers drifting through taverns and palace corridors. Of course, medieval medicine was not exactly precise. Doctors at the time had many theories about illness. None of them were particularly correct, but they were delivered with great confidence, which is usually half the job. One physician might blame the stars. Another might blame bad air, what they called miasma. And someone else would probably blame eating too many figs. But a few observant people, the quiet ones in the background of history, began noticing something else. The sickly children often belonged to royal families. Which, if you know anything about royal marriage habits, might not be entirely shocking. Because European monarchies had a bit of a tradition. A tradition that historians politely call dynastic consolidation. And everyone else calls marrying your cousins. Sometimes your first cousin. Sometimes your second cousin. Occasionally your niece. And once in a while, well, let's just say the family tree started looking less like a tree and more like a decorative wreath. The logic behind these marriages was actually very simple. Kings and queens wanted to keep power within the family. Land stayed in the family. Wealth stayed in the family. Alliances stayed in the family. Genes, unfortunately, also stayed in the family. And over time, this created some unusual results. But before we get to the most famous examples, the Habsburgs, the Spanish royals, the famously tragic princes, we should begin where many strange royal stories begin. With a quiet court, a worried queen, and a child who simply didn't grow the way everyone expected. So let's drift for a moment to the Iberian Peninsula. Spain and Portugal were rising powers in Europe. Their ships crossed oceans. Their gold flowed into royal treasuries. Their kings dressed in velvet and believed they were chosen by God. Which, historically speaking, is often the beginning of some very questionable decisions. One particular royal household began noticing something odd in their young heirs. Children who seemed delicate. Not in the poetic sense. more in the "this child catches every illness known to man" sense. A prince might survive infancy, which was already a pretty impressive achievement in medieval times, only to struggle with basic health for the rest of his life. He might walk late, speak slowly, catch infections easily. Royal doctors, naturally, had explanations. Bad humors, poor planetary alignment, too much moisture in the body, possibly demons. Again, medieval medicine had a lot of theories. But the pattern continued. And here's the thing about royal families, they keep extremely detailed records. Births, deaths, marriages, cousins marrying cousins, cousins marrying slightly more distant cousins, cousins marrying cousins from another royal family who were also cousins. Eventually, historians looking back at these records started noticing something fascinating. Some royal bloodlines were becoming genetically narrow. Imagine copying the same document again and again, until the ink starts to blur and letters begin disappearing. That's not a perfect scientific metaphor, but it's close enough for bedtime history. One of the most famous examples of this phenomenon would eventually appear in the House of Habsburg. Now the Habsburgs were impressive. They ruled enormous parts of Europe for centuries. Austria, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, bits of Italy, chunks of the Netherlands, basically half the map at one point. And they gained much of that power through marriage. Not war. Marriage. There was even a famous phrase about them. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Which sounds romantic. Until you realize they mostly married each other. And this brings us to one of the most quietly tragic characters in European royal history. A child who would eventually become known as Charles II of Spain. Now, we won't dive fully into Charles tonight. That particular story deserves its own slow chapter later. But even at his birth in 1661, court observers noticed something concerning. The boy was fragile. Extremely fragile. He struggled to eat. His jaw was unusually large. His body developed slowly. Walking took years longer than expected. Court physicians, of course, remained optimistic. They always were. Royal doctors had a special skill, reassuring the king that everything was fine, right up until it clearly wasn't. But behind the scenes, diplomats and visitors began whispering. Because Charles II represented the end point of generations of royal cousin marriages. His family tree, and this is not an exaggeration, looked less like a branching structure and more like a ladder. The same ancestors appeared again, and again, and again. Historians later calculated that Charles had roughly the same level of genetic relatedness as the child of a brother and sister. Which, biologically speaking, is not ideal. And poor Charles spent most of his life dealing with the consequences. But again, we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Because long before Charles II appeared, the seeds of these dynastic problems were already quietly spreading through royal courts. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just slowly, generation by generation. A king marries his cousin to secure an alliance. Their children grow up and marry another cousin to maintain the dynasty. Those children marry yet another cousin because the options outside the family are apparently unacceptable. And eventually you arrive at a royal baby who enters the world already carrying centuries of genetic recycling. Now, to be fair, medieval and early modern people did not understand genetics. Gregor Mendel and pea plants were still centuries away. So kings and queens had no idea that their marriage strategies were quietly stacking the biological deck against themselves. From their perspective, they were doing the responsible thing. They were protecting the throne, preserving royal blood, maintaining political alliances, and occasionally producing princes who needed 3 servants just to stand up. But again, this didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, drifting process. A few sickly children here. A slightly odd facial structure there. A prince who couldn't produce heirs. A queen who lost several infants. At first these things seemed random. Just the natural unpredictability of life in the pre-modern world. Because remember, even outside royal families, childhood survival rates were not exactly stellar. But over time the patterns became harder to ignore. Especially for ambassadors visiting different courts. Diplomats were basically the gossip collectors of early modern Europe. They wrote long reports back to their kings describing everything they saw. Political alliances. Military strength. And occasionally, the physical condition of foreign monarchs. Some of these reports are unintentionally hilarious. One ambassador described a prince as handsome from afar, though less so upon closer inspection. Which is diplomatic language for, something about this man is not quite right. Another described a royal child as gentle in spirit and somewhat slow in development. Which is diplomatic language for, the boy struggles to function normally. But again, none of this was framed as a genetic issue at the time. It was simply, royal misfortune. Or divine will. Or occasionally bad parenting. Because medieval courts loved blaming mothers for everything. Of course they did. And yet the pattern continued. Royal bloodlines across Europe were slowly becoming complicated. Spain, Austria, France, England. All interconnected through marriage. All determined to keep power within the same small network of families. And as ships continued sailing between ports, carrying letters, diplomats, and rumors, stories of fragile princes and unusual royal illnesses drifted quietly across the continent. A queen in Vienna might hear about a sickly child in Madrid. A duke in France might hear whispers about strange facial features in the Austrian court. Nothing scandalous. Just little pieces of information. Like faint ripples on water. And if we glide gently forward through time, those ripples eventually become full historical waves. Because by the 17th century, the consequences of centuries of royal intermarriage would become impossible to ignore. Courts filled with doctors. Princes who struggled to rule. Dynasties collapsing because heirs simply didn't survive. But that part of the story unfolds slowly. Very slowly. And tonight, we're not rushing anywhere. So take a breath. Relax. Let the candlelight of medieval Europe flicker quietly in your imagination. Because in the next part, we'll drift deeper into the strange world of royal bloodlines. And meet some of the most genetically unfortunate monarchs in history. Kings who ruled empires, while their own family trees quietly folded in on themselves. Which, historically speaking, tends to end exactly the way you'd expect. Hey guys, tonight we begin somewhere quiet. So before we start, maybe dim the lights a little. Put your phone on low brightness. Get comfortable. Maybe pull the blanket a little higher, because tonight we're drifting slowly back into a strange moment in history. A moment when entire cities seemed to hold their breath. No battles. No loud kings shouting orders. Just empty streets, flickering candles, and the quiet feeling that something invisible had entered the world. Because long before modern medicine, long before people understood germs or bacteria or viruses, sickness was mostly mysterious. It simply arrived. It wandered into towns like an uninvited guest. And once it appeared, people filled the silence with explanations. Some blamed the stars. Some blamed bad air. And quite a few blamed each other. Now picture a European port city somewhere in the late medieval world. The kind of place where ships arrive slowly at dawn. Tall wooden vessels creaking gently against the docks. Sailors unloading barrels, spices, sacks of grain, and occasionally rumors. Because ships carried news almost as often as they carried cargo. A merchant might step off a vessel from another city and casually mention that something strange was happening there. People getting sick. Streets becoming quiet. Churches filling faster than usual. At first these rumors sounded like the usual background noise of medieval life. Illness was common. Cities were crowded. Hygiene was, let's say, inconsistent. But something about these whispers felt different. The stories grew. One town reported dozens of people falling ill. Another town described families staying inside their homes. A third city said entire neighborhoods had gone strangely silent. And silence in a medieval city was not normal. These places were usually loud. Markets shouting. Animals wandering through streets. Blacksmiths hammering metal. Children running around barefoot. So when streets became quiet, people noticed. And when people notice something unusual but don't understand it, the human mind starts filling in the gaps. This is where superstition begins to bloom. A priest might say the illness was divine punishment. Because historically speaking, divine punishment explained quite a lot of things. An astrologer might point toward a strange alignment of planets. Medieval courts loved astrologers. They were basically the official cosmic advisors of the time. And ordinary townspeople had their own theories. Maybe the wells were poisoned. Maybe foreign travelers carried a curse. Maybe certain groups of people were secretly responsible. Which, sadly, leads to some very dark moments in history. But tonight we won't focus on the darker violence that sometimes followed. Instead we'll stay with the quieter part of the story. The part where fear simply settles over a place. Because fear in the medieval world had a very particular rhythm. First came confusion. Then came rumors. Then came small, strange changes in everyday life. Markets opened later. Taverns closed earlier. Families stopped visiting neighbors. Bells rang more often for funerals. And slowly, the streets began to empty. Now let's float for a moment to one of the most famous examples of this atmosphere, European cities during waves of plague. The most famous outbreak began in the 14th century, when a disease we now call Black Death spread across much of Europe. But again, tonight we're not focusing on dramatic scenes or frightening descriptions. Instead, we'll drift gently through the strange mood that settled over towns during these times. Imagine waking up early in the morning in a medieval city like Florence or Venice. Normally the streets would already be alive. Merchants preparing stalls. Bakers pulling bread from ovens. Fishmongers shouting about the freshness of their catch, whether it was fresh or not. But during outbreaks, the city felt different. Doors stayed closed. Windows were shuttered. And people walked quickly, avoiding each other. Not because they fully understood contagion, but because instinct told them distance might help. It's a surprisingly modern reaction, actually. Even without microscopes or science textbooks, humans often sense when something in the environment is wrong. But of course, fear never stays quiet for long. Soon the strange explanations began multiplying. Some believed the disease came from poisoned air drifting in from distant lands. Others believed it came from ships arriving at port, carrying sickness along with their cargo. And to be fair, ships really did help diseases travel. Sailors moved between continents long before modern quarantine systems existed. So when a ship arrived from a troubled port, people watched it carefully. Very carefully. Sometimes the crew looked exhausted. Pale. Quiet. And occasionally a sailor might step onto the dock already showing signs that something was wrong. This is where authorities began experimenting with one of history's earliest public health ideas. Quarantine. In the port city of Venice, officials eventually created a rule that ships had to wait for 40 days before passengers could enter the city. 40 days. The Italian word for 40, quaranta, eventually gave us the word quarantine. Which is a strangely calm solution for a very anxious problem. Imagine sitting on a ship just offshore for weeks, staring at the city you want to enter, while guards watch from a distance to make sure you stay exactly where you are. Not exactly a relaxing vacation. But these measures slowly became common in major trading ports. Because by the late medieval and early modern periods, people had started noticing patterns. Illness followed trade routes. Ships arrived, and soon afterward cities reported sickness. So while they didn't understand bacteria or fleas or pathogens, they understood cause and effect. Now while ordinary towns struggled with fear and superstition, royal courts experienced the same events in their own, slightly dramatic way. Because kings and queens were just as afraid of disease as everyone else. Possibly more afraid. After all, a royal death could throw an entire kingdom into chaos. So when illness approached a capital city, courts sometimes reacted by simply leaving. Yes. Kings occasionally solved the problem by packing their bags and moving somewhere else. A royal household could relocate quickly. Hundreds of servants, wagons full of furniture, cooks, guards, priests, all traveling together like a very fancy moving caravan. If sickness reached one palace, they simply tried another one. Which must have been very comforting for the peasants left behind. But again, medieval rulers believed distance was protection. If the air in one city was poisoned, perhaps the countryside would be safer. If the streets were dangerous, maybe a remote castle would help. And so royal courts drifted across the landscape, trying to stay ahead of invisible threats. Meanwhile, cities slowly adapted to life under the shadow of disease. Doctors wore strange protective clothing. Some carried bundles of herbs, believing pleasant smells could protect them from bad air. Others developed elaborate rituals for cleaning homes, burning incense, or sealing certain buildings. Churches filled with prayer. And graveyards quietly expanded. But alongside all this seriousness, human life continued in its usual odd way. People still gossiped. Merchants still argued over prices. And rulers still made extremely questionable marriage decisions that would eventually cause their own unique problems. Which brings us, slowly, gently, back to the world of royal dynasties. Because while cities worried about mysterious illnesses arriving by ship, royal families were quietly creating a different kind of long-term problem. A problem that didn't arrive suddenly. It didn't appear overnight. Instead it crept through family trees across centuries. One cousin marrying another cousin. One dynasty trying to keep power within a very small circle of families. And generation by generation, the results became more noticeable. Princes who struggled with health. Princesses who produced very few surviving children. Kings who looked, well, a little unusual. Which is how we eventually arrive at one of the most famous royal families in European history. The endlessly interconnected, endlessly married House of Habsburg. Now the Habsburgs were incredibly successful politically. They ruled huge territories across Europe. Their motto might as well have been, "Why conquer land when you can just marry it?" And for a while, that strategy worked beautifully. But over generations, those marriages kept circling back into the same extended family. Which created some very recognizable physical traits. Most famously, the legendary Habsburg jaw. A very prominent lower jaw that appeared again and again in portraits of the dynasty. Some paintings show kings who look confident and powerful. Others look like someone gently stretched their chin forward while they weren't paying attention. Historians often joke about this feature, but for the people living at the time, it was just another royal characteristic. A family trait. Like eye color. Or stubborn political habits. But as centuries passed, those traits became more extreme. Children were born weaker. Health problems increased. And eventually the dynasty produced some monarchs whose lives were quietly tragic. Princes who struggled to speak clearly. Kings who required assistance for basic tasks. Rulers whose bodies simply didn't cooperate with the responsibilities placed on them. And the most famous of them all, the final Habsburg King of Spain. A boy born into enormous power, but also into centuries of genetic repetition. His name was Charles II of Spain. But we won't rush into his story just yet. Because tonight, we're moving slowly. Like a ship drifting toward a quiet harbor. For now, just imagine Europe during those uneasy centuries. Cities watching the horizon for arriving ships. People whispering about strange illnesses. Kings quietly relocating their courts to safer palaces. And royal families continuing their very determined habit of marrying within the same narrow circle of cousins, because apparently expanding the dating pool was simply not an option. Which, historically speaking, sets up some very strange chapters ahead. So take another slow breath. Let the streets grow quiet again. And in the next part, we'll drift deeper into royal households themselves. Where sickly princes, nervous queens, and extremely determined marriage alliances slowly created some of the most unusual family trees in history. And as we'll see, some of those trees barely qualified as trees at all. More like elaborate family loops. But that is where our story gently floats next. Hey guys, tonight we're going to slow things down again. So if you're listening in bed, maybe dim the lights a little. Let the room get quiet. Put the phone on low brightness, and just relax while we drift gently back through time. Tonight's story moves through one of the stranger atmospheres in human history. A time when cities didn't fully understand illness, doctors tried remedies that were, let's say, creative, and ordinary people tried almost anything that might keep them alive another week. Nothing loud tonight. No battles. No dramatic kings shouting from balconies. Just quiet streets, exhausted healers, and the slow rhythm of medieval life trying to make sense of sickness. Because if you walk into a European town somewhere in the 14th century, maybe a place like Florence or Paris, you would notice something almost immediately. The atmosphere felt heavy. Not just physically, but emotionally. Church bells rang more often than usual. Market stalls opened later, and closed earlier. People spoke in lower voices, as if saying the wrong thing might somehow invite trouble. And at the edges of the city, workers quietly dug long trenches in the earth. These were the mass graves. Not dramatic scenes. Not chaotic shouting. Just tired laborers doing a job that needed to be done. Because during major outbreaks of disease, the normal rituals around death became difficult to maintain. There were simply too many funerals. Families wanted proper burials. Priests wanted proper prayers. But time moved faster than tradition. So graves grew larger. And cities adapted in the calm, practical way humans usually do when facing overwhelming problems. Now today we know these outbreaks were often caused by diseases like the infamous Black Death, which spread across Europe in waves during the 1300s. But medieval people didn't know that. There were no microscopes. No germ theory. No idea that tiny organisms were quietly traveling from person to person. Instead, they had theories. Lots of theories. And honestly, some of them were pretty imaginative. One very popular explanation involved bad air, or what people called miasma. The belief was simple: sickness floated through the atmosphere like an invisible fog. So if the air smelled unpleasant, that was obviously suspicious. Which explains why medieval doctors spent a surprising amount of time carrying fragrant herbs. Mint. Rosemary. Lavender. Sometimes they stuffed these plants into cloth masks or held them near their noses while visiting patients. Did it stop disease? Not really. But it probably made the situation smell better, which, psychologically speaking, is something. And medieval medicine had plenty of these small psychological comforts. Doctors believed the human body contained 4 basic fluids called humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these humors became unbalanced, illness appeared. So treatment often involved trying to restore balance. Which might include things like careful diets, herbal tonics, or the famously popular practice of bloodletting. Yes. Removing blood from the body to make the patient healthier. This sounds counterintuitive today. But at the time it seemed logical. If the body contained too much blood, removing some of it might restore harmony. Unfortunately, when a patient was already weak, removing blood sometimes made things worse. But again, the doctors were doing the best they could with the knowledge available. And it's important to remember that medieval physicians were often highly educated. They studied ancient medical texts from scholars like Hippocrates and Galen. Their methods weren't random. They were based on centuries of tradition, even if that tradition turned out to be slightly misguided. Now well-trained physicians worked in cities and royal courts. Which herbs reduced fever, and which teas might calm a restless stomach? Some of these remedies actually worked quite well. Nature, after all, contains many powerful medicines. But in times of crisis, fear sometimes turned against these healers. When disease spread rapidly and people searched for someone to blame, suspicion occasionally fell on those who practiced unusual medicine. Again, human psychology hasn't changed very much over the centuries. When something frightening happens, people look for explanations. And sometimes they choose the wrong ones. But tonight we're not lingering on those darker accusations. Instead we'll stay with the strange creativity that appeared when people tried to cure the incurable. Because medieval remedies could become surprisingly elaborate. Some doctors recommended bathing in rosewater. Others prescribed mixtures of crushed gemstones, because certain stones were believed to hold mystical healing power. And then there were the truly desperate treatments. Drinking potions made from rare animal ingredients. Burning herbs inside homes to purify the air. Carrying protective charms blessed by priests. All of it designed to push illness away, even if nobody fully understood how illness arrived in the first place. Meanwhile, life in royal courts continued with its usual mixture of luxury and anxiety. Kings and queens feared disease just as much as ordinary citizens. Possibly more. After all, the death of a monarch could create enormous political problems. Succession crises. Power struggles. Competing heirs suddenly appearing with extremely confident claims to the throne. So royal households invested heavily in medical care. Court physicians lived inside palaces. Special diets were prepared. Rooms were carefully ventilated. And if sickness approached a capital city, rulers sometimes took the simplest precaution available. They left. Yes. Entire royal courts occasionally relocated to avoid outbreaks. Hundreds of servants packing furniture, clothing, books, and silverware, all traveling to a different castle in the countryside. A medieval version of working remotely, if you like. Which brings us slowly toward one of the quieter ironies of royal life. Even as kings tried to protect their families from outside diseases, they were unknowingly creating another health problem entirely. A genetic one. Because royal marriages followed a very specific rule. Marry someone powerful. Preferably someone connected to your own dynasty. And ideally someone who keeps land, money, and political alliances safely inside the family. Which sounds sensible, politically. But biologically, it created complications. Lots of them. Royal cousins married royal cousins. Uncles married nieces. Dynasties interlocked across Europe like complicated puzzle pieces. And over centuries, the family trees started folding back onto themselves. One famous example would later appear in the powerful House of Habsburg. The Habsburgs ruled enormous territories across Europe. Austria, Spain, parts of Italy, regions of the Netherlands. They didn't always gain land through war. Instead, they married into it. A strategy so successful that historians sometimes joke their national motto was basically, let someone else fight the battles. We'll handle the weddings. And they did. Over and over again. Within a relatively small circle of royal relatives. Which produced a number of distinctive physical traits. Most famously, the Habsburg jaw. A large, protruding lower jaw visible in many portraits of the dynasty. Some paintings show proud kings with strong chins. Others look like someone gently pulled their jaw forward during the portrait session and nobody wanted to mention it. Of course, artists often tried to flatter their royal subjects. Which means if a portrait looks slightly unusual, the real person may have looked even more unusual. But again, this didn't happen suddenly. The effects built slowly over generations. One marriage. Then another. Then another. Each time the genetic pool became just a little smaller. And eventually, royal children began experiencing unusual health problems. Weak immune systems. Delayed development. Physical abnormalities. Difficulties producing heirs. Which, for a monarchy, is a very serious issue. Because the entire political system depended on producing the next ruler. And if that ruler struggled to survive, or struggled to have children, the whole dynasty began wobbling like a chair missing one leg. This slow genetic narrowing reached its most famous example in the final Habsburg king of Spain. A boy born into unimaginable power, but also centuries of repeated royal intermarriage. His name was Charles II of Spain. Observers at court noticed his fragile health almost immediately. He struggled to eat. Struggled to walk. Struggled to speak clearly. But again, tonight we're not rushing into his full story. Because like many historical tragedies, it unfolds slowly. Very slowly. For now, just imagine Europe during those uneasy centuries. Cities dealing with mysterious diseases. Healers experimenting with herbs, charms, and occasionally questionable medical procedures. Royal families trying to avoid outside illness, while unknowingly passing inherited problems through generations of carefully arranged marriages. It's a strange contrast. Common people fearing invisible sickness from the outside world. Kings quietly creating their own health problems from within the palace walls. History has a sense of irony like that. And as we continue drifting through this sleepy little historical landscape, we'll meet more royal characters whose lives were shaped by these quiet dynastic choices. Princes who ruled enormous empires, while struggling with bodies that never quite cooperated. Queens trapped inside political marriages with cousins they barely knew. And royal children who carried the weight of centuries of family decisions, long before they understood what a dynasty even was. But for now, let the story slow down again. Imagine those quiet medieval streets. The distant ringing of church bells. The tired healers preparing another herbal mixture. And somewhere inside a palace, another royal baby being born into one of the most complicated family trees in history. And as we'll soon see, that tree was about to grow even stranger. Hey guys, tonight we begin at the quiet end of a very loud chapter in history. So if you're settling into bed, maybe dim the lights a little. Let your shoulders relax. Put the phone somewhere comfortable, and just listen as we slowly drift back a few centuries. Tonight's story doesn't start with kings giving speeches or armies marching across fields. It begins with silence. A strange kind of silence that settles over entire landscapes after something enormous has passed through. The kind of silence where birds still sing, wind still moves through trees, but human life feels oddly paused. Because across much of Europe in the mid-1300s, after waves of disease swept through towns and cities, many villages simply stopped. Not dramatically. Not with a loud collapse. Just gradually. Houses stood with doors slightly open. Fields waited for farmers who never returned. Wells sat unused. And entire communities quietly slipped out of existence. Historians often connect this moment to the devastating pandemic known as the Black Death, which traveled along trade routes and reshaped much of the medieval world. But tonight we're not focusing on dramatic tragedy. Instead we're drifting gently into the strange, almost surreal aftermath, when people slowly stepped outside again and realized the world had changed. Because when disease finally moved on from a region, the landscape looked different. Not ruined exactly. Just emptier. Imagine walking along a road in rural England sometime around the late 1300s. You pass a farmhouse. The roof still stands. The door swings lightly in the wind. But no smoke rises from the chimney. Further down the road, another house appears. Also quiet. Eventually you reach a small village square where a few buildings remain, but the people who once filled them are gone. This wasn't rare. Across Europe, hundreds of small settlements were abandoned during and after major outbreaks. Some villages shrank dramatically. Others disappeared entirely. Historians sometimes call these places lost villages. And you can still find traces of them today, faint outlines of foundations beneath grass fields, or old church ruins standing alone in the countryside. Now for the people who survived, this emptiness created a strange new reality. On one hand, life was still difficult. The medieval world never suddenly became comfortable. But on the other hand, survivors found themselves in an unusual position. There was suddenly more land than workers. More opportunity than before. If a farmer had previously struggled to find work, now landowners were eager to hire anyone who could plant crops. Wages slowly increased. Peasants gained a little more bargaining power. Which, from the perspective of medieval nobility, was extremely inconvenient. Because the feudal system relied heavily on a large population of workers tied closely to the land. When that population suddenly shrank, the balance shifted. Farmers could move. Laborers could demand better treatment. And kings across Europe began realizing that the social structure they depended on was slowly rearranging itself. Not overnight. But steadily. Now while villages adjusted to this new reality, life inside royal courts continued with its usual mixture of luxury, politics, and extremely complicated family relationships. Because while ordinary people were rebuilding their communities, kings were still busy arranging marriages. Strategic marriages. Dynastic marriages. And occasionally, marriages that made genealogists several centuries later stare at family trees with quiet concern. Royal marriage had one main goal: preserve power. If two kingdoms could be connected through marriage, alliances became stronger. Land stayed inside the dynasty. Rival families were kept at a distance. But this strategy often meant the same small circle of European royal families kept marrying each other. Again. And again. And again. Which slowly created one of the most famous examples of dynastic repetition in history, the powerful House of Habsburg. The Habsburgs were astonishingly successful politically. They ruled territories across Central Europe, Spain, parts of Italy, and several other regions. Their family motto might as well have been, "Why conquer land when you can marry it?" And honestly, it worked. For centuries. But there was a biological side effect to this strategy. Because many of those marriages happened within the extended family. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. Second cousins married, well, slightly closer cousins. Which slowly reduced the genetic diversity within the dynasty. Now medieval people didn't understand genetics. The science simply didn't exist yet. But they did notice patterns. Certain physical features appeared again and again in Habsburg portraits. Most famously, the Habsburg jaw. A very prominent lower jaw that gave some members of the dynasty a distinctive profile. Artists tried to soften it in paintings. Some succeeded. Others, less so. One famous portrait shows a Habsburg ruler looking dignified and proud, while also appearing slightly like someone stretched his chin forward while he was distracted. But again, these features developed gradually. At first they were simply family traits. No one worried too much. Royal courts had seen unusual appearances before. But over generations, the effects became more noticeable. Health problems increased. Some children struggled physically. Others developed slowly. A few monarchs faced serious difficulties producing heirs, which, for a hereditary monarchy, is about as convenient as forgetting the keys to your own castle. And this slow genetic narrowing eventually produced one of the most famous figures in European royal history. A king whose life quietly illustrated the long-term consequences of dynastic intermarriage. His name was Charles II of Spain. But before we drift fully into his story, let's pause for a moment inside another royal court. Because the aftermath of the great medieval pandemics didn't just change villages and farms. It also changed the way rulers thought about power. With populations reduced and economies shifting, kings had to adapt. Taxes were adjusted. Laws were rewritten. And royal families became even more careful about maintaining alliances. Marriage became the most important political tool available. If a prince married the daughter of another powerful ruler, two kingdoms could become connected overnight. Which meant royal children were rarely raised with the expectation of choosing their own partners. Instead, their futures were planned from infancy. A princess born in Vienna might be promised to a prince in Madrid before she even learned to walk. A young prince might grow up knowing his future wife was already waiting in another court somewhere across Europe. Romantic? Not particularly. Efficient? Extremely. And sometimes, genetically questionable. But from the perspective of royal advisors, these marriages made perfect sense. Keeping power within a trusted network of families reduced political risk. Allowing outsiders into that network might create dangerous rivals. So dynasties continued marrying within their extended circle, which meant the family trees of European royalty slowly began looping back on themselves. Genealogists today sometimes describe these trees using diagrams that look less like trees, and more like very complicated knots. The same ancestors appearing multiple times in different branches. The same family names repeating again and again. And occasionally, a royal child inheriting a combination of traits that made life rather difficult. Which brings us gently back to poor Charles II. When he was born in Madrid in 1661, the Spanish court celebrated enthusiastically. After all, he was the heir to one of the most powerful empires in the world. Spain controlled vast territories across Europe and the Americas. Its treasure fleets crossed the Atlantic carrying silver and gold. And this fragile little boy was destined to inherit it all. But almost immediately, people noticed something concerning. Charles struggled with basic development. He walked late. He spoke slowly. Eating could be difficult due to his jaw structure. Visitors to court wrote careful descriptions in diplomatic letters. One ambassador politely noted that the young king was weak of body though gentle of temperament. Which, in the polite language of diplomacy, meant the situation was worrying. Yet despite these difficulties, Charles eventually became king. Because dynasties follow rules. If you are the rightful heir, the crown is yours. Even if ruling an empire might require a little more assistance than usual. But again, we'll explore his life more slowly later. For now, just imagine Europe in the centuries after the great pandemics. Fields slowly returning to cultivation. Villages rebuilding. Cities adjusting to new economic realities. And inside grand palaces, royal families continuing their careful dance of marriage alliances. A dance that slowly shaped the political map of Europe, while also quietly shaping the genetic health of its rulers. History often moves like this. Huge events change the world dramatically, and then quieter decisions ripple forward for generations. Pandemics reshape societies. And dynasties reshape themselves. Sometimes wisely. Sometimes, not quite so wisely. So as we continue drifting through this slow historical landscape, we'll meet more kings, queens, and princes whose lives were shaped by these long chains of decisions. Some were brilliant rulers. Some were eccentric. And a few were so genetically unlucky that historians still shake their heads centuries later. But for now, let the story settle into that quiet medieval countryside again. Empty fields slowly filling with new life. Ruined villages fading into memory. And somewhere in a distant palace, another royal child being born into a family tree that was becoming increasingly complicated. And as we float forward into the next part, we'll meet some of the most unusual members of those dynasties. Kings who inherited entire empires. Along with a few, very inconvenient family traits.